The arrival. The night sky above New York shimmered with restless energy. Airplanes dipped into the horizon, their lights trailing like fireflies across the velvet dark. Inside one of those planes sat Jiang Wei, his posture straight but his mind heavy with expectation. He was not an ordinary traveler. At just 42, Jiang Wei had built an empire of technology companies across Shanghai and Shenzhen, earning him the nickname the Silent Visionary. Silent because he rarely spoke publicly, visionary because every venture he touched flourished into something remarkable. Tonight, he arrived in Manhattan for an international investment summit at the prestigious Regal Hotel, one of the city's crown jewels in luxury. The summit promised not just opportunity, but a stage to solidify his global presence. Yet Jiang Wei felt a strange unease. Though his companies spanned continents, he had always let his work speak louder than his words. English had never been his strength. In China, he didn't need it. Even abroad, assistants, interpreters, and polished CEOs filled in the gaps. But for this trip, wanting to show independence, he had come alone. The hotel lobby. The Regal Hotel's lobby was a cathedral of excess. Glass chandeliers rained light across marble floors, and polished brass railings gleamed as though touched by the sun itself. Wealthy guests in designer suits drifted through like royalty. Staff in crisp uniforms moved with mechanical precision, bowing, smiling, offering drinks. Jiang Wei stepped into this palace of opulence wearing a tailored charcoal gray suit. His suitcase rolled behind him, silent except for the faint click of its wheels. His eyes scanned the grandeur with polite admiration, but his expression remained reserved, almost stern. He was used to wealth. What mattered more to him was how people treated one another. At the check-in desk stood Robert Eaton, the hotel manager, tall, silver-haired, with a smile so practiced it bordered on insincere. Two receptionists flanked him, their fingers tapping across keyboards as they checked in guests. When Jiang Wei approached, murmurs fluttered across the lobby. Some guests recognized him from business magazines. Others only saw a foreigner, stiff and expressionless, not fitting the picture of charm they expected. Jiang Wei set his passport and reservation confirmation on the counter. He greeted Robert in Mandarin. 晚上好，我是张伟，我有预定. Good evening, I am Jiang Wei, I have a reservation. The receptionist blinked, confused. Robert's smile stiffened. Sir, he said slowly, this is the Regal Hotel. If you can't speak English, perhaps you should have brought an interpreter. The words were not shouted, yet their condescension carried louder than any raised voice. Conversations around the lobby dimmed. Heads turned. Whispers of contempt from the lounge, a couple of wealthy guests exchanged knowing smirks. Maybe he just got off his jet and forgot to learn English, one whispered. All the money in the world, yet no manners, another added. The remarks cut deeper than they intended. Jiang Wei understood enough English to catch their ridicule. For the first time in his career, standing in a hall built to honor prestige, he felt isolated. Not because of language, but because of the invisible walls people built with pride and prejudice. He tried again, gesturing politely. Reservation. Jiang Wei. Business summit. His accent bent around the English words like bamboo in the wind, flexible yet not fitting the rigid Western tongue. Robert sighed, as if granting charity. We'll try to find it. Please wait. The dismissive tone, not hostile but indifferent, struck harder than open insult. Jiang Wei's chest tightened. Was wealth nothing if one could not shape it into the language of power? The maid in the shadows near the far corner of the lobby, quietly arranging flowers in tall crystal vases, stood Amara Johnson, a maid whose presence rarely registered in the eyes of guests. She was young, mid-20s, her uniform simple, her curly hair tied back neatly. She moved with the grace of someone who had endured much yet carried herself with quiet dignity. Unlike the others, Amara did not stare at Jiang Wei with ridicule. Instead, her eyes softened with recognition. The cadence of his Mandarin words stirred memories from years past. Long nights spent studying Chinese textbooks. Late afternoons working at a small Chinatown bookstore. Evenings chatting with elderly immigrants who appreciated her effort. Life had forced her to take this job at the Regal Hotel, polishing, cleaning, arranging. But hidden within her was a gift. Fluency in a language few expected from someone like her. As she overheard Robert's dismissive tone and the guest's cruel whispers, a flicker of fire sparked in her chest. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, unseen, judged before one had a chance to reveal their worth, and she would not let this moment pass. The first connection, Amara stepped forward. At first, Robert frowned. Staff weren't meant to interrupt. But she ignored the weight of his glare and approached Zhang Wei with quiet confidence. Bowing slightly, she spoke in Mandarin. 您好, 先生. 您需要帮助吗? Hello, sir. Do you need help? Zhang Wei's eyes widened. The sound of his mother tongue, spoken clearly and fluently in this foreign land, washed over him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For a moment, disbelief froze him. Then relief followed, mingled with gratitude. 你会说中文? He asked, his voice softer now. You speak Chinese? Amara smiled gently. 会的，我学了很多年。您是来参加商务会议的吗? Yes, I do. I studied for many years. You are here for the business summit, right? The entire lobby seemed to pause. Whispers shifted. The same guest who mocked now looked astonished. Robert's polished mask cracked ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing. Ripples of respect Zhang Wei straightened, pride returning to his shoulders. Through Amara, he explained his reservation details, his purpose for attending the summit, his travel needs. She translated every word with precision, turning his Mandarin into fluent English that even Robert could not dismiss. Yes, Mr. Zhang has a presidential suite reserved under his company's account, she announced firmly, her voice steady. He is one of the keynote investors for tomorrow's summit. Robert's face flushed. The weight of his earlier words hung heavy in the silence. With forced politeness, he bowed slightly. Of course, Mr. Zhang. My apologies for the misunderstanding. We'll prepare your suite immediately. But Zhang Wei wasn't looking at Robert anymore. His gaze rested on Amara, this maid who had chosen to step forward when no one else did, who saw not just a wealthy man lost in translation but a human being yearning to be understood. Seeds of transformation, as bellhop scrambled to take his luggage, Zhang Wei whispered to Amara in Mandarin, 谢谢你，没有呢我会被他们羞辱. Thank you. Without you I would have been humiliated. She shook her head softly. 不用谢，我知道被忽视的感觉. Don't thank me. I know what it feels like to be overlooked. That night, as Zhang Wei settled into his lavish suite, the crystal chandeliers above him felt less important than the single act of kindness he had received. He thought of Amara's courage, how she had defied hierarchy to defend his dignity. And something stirred within him, curiosity, admiration, and a sense that this meeting was no accident. In the grand halls of Manhattan, where wealth and status dictated worth, one unexpected voice had broken through, a voice that carried not just language but empathy, and so the story truly began. The quiet strength. The following morning dawned over Manhattan with a clarity that made the skyscrapers glow like glass monoliths rising into the heavens. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his presidential suite, Zhang Wei could see the bustling veins of the city below, yellow taxis darting like bees in search of nectar, while pedestrians hurried across intersections with coffees in hand and phones glued to their ears. The city radiated ambition, urgency, and a kind of relentless rhythm that seemed to mirror the very heartbeat of modern capitalism. Yet despite the grandeur of his surroundings, Zhang Wei woke with a restlessness that gnawed at him. The events of the previous evening replayed in his mind with stubborn persistence. The sting of Robert's disdain, the cruel whispers of wealthy strangers, and then the unexpected intervention of Amara, the maid who had spoken Mandarin as though she had been born in Beijing rather than Brooklyn. For most of his career, Zhang Wei had learned to measure human beings in terms of efficiency, reliability, and professional contribution. Yet here, in a single act of kindness, a hotel maid had dismantled his pride, restored his dignity, and reminded him that respect was not something one demanded through money or power, but something offered freely by those who still believed in humanity. He found himself staring out the window, his mind less on the meetings of the day and more on the woman who had stood by him in his moment of humiliation. Who was she? Why had she chosen to learn Mandarin, a language so many in the West dismissed as too difficult, too foreign? What hardships had she endured that gave her the courage to stand before her superiors and contradict them, risking her position in the process? These questions refused to leave him. Later that morning, as Zhang Wei descended to the grand dining hall for breakfast, He carried himself with his usual composure, but there was a subtle difference in his demeanor. He no longer looked at the chandeliers or the polished marble floors as symbols of grandeur. Instead, he scanned the hall with quiet curiosity, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of Amara among the staff. The dining hall was alive with conversation. Investors, bankers, and entrepreneurs from across the globe exchanged words in English, French, German, and Spanish. Waiters in pristine uniforms glided between tables carrying trays laden with fruits, smoked salmon, and golden croissants. Jiang Wei sat alone at a corner table, his eyes fixed on the steaming cup of green tea placed before him. It was there, amidst the clinking of silverware and the hum of conversation, that he spotted her. Amara entered quietly from the far side, carrying a tray of fresh flowers to replace the centerpieces on the tables. Her movements were graceful yet deliberate, her presence almost invisible to the room's elite, but Jiang Wei's attention was drawn to her instantly. As she approached his table, he offered the faintest smile, one that was genuine but restrained by the formality of their environment. "Zhao Shanghao," he greeted softly in Mandarin. "Good morning." Amara paused, her eyes lighting up with recognition. She replied in the same tongue, her words fluent, her accent surprisingly precise. 早上好，张先生。你睡得好吗? Good morning, Mr. Zhang. Did you sleep well? Their brief exchange caught the attention of nearby diners who turned with mild surprise, once again confronted with the image of a maid conversing fluently, in a language most of them could not even attempt to understand. Yet unlike the night before, Jiang Wei felt no shame in their stares. If anything, he felt a quiet pride in acknowledging Amara publicly, giving her presence the respect she deserved. After she replaced the flowers, Jiang Wei leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice. "You surprised me yesterday," he said, reverting to English for her comfort, though his accent carried traces of Mandarin tones. "Why do you speak my language so well?" Amara hesitated, as though weighing whether to share a part of herself she usually kept hidden. Finally, she set down the empty vase and met his gaze with calm honesty. "Because when I was younger, I wanted to understand people who were invisible in this city. My neighborhood was full of immigrants, Chinese families, shop owners, workers who barely spoke English. They were laughed at, ignored, treated as though they were burdens. I learned Mandarin so I could talk to them, listen to them, let them know that somebody cared." Her words struck him like a chord, resonating in places of his heart he had long ignored. For years, Jiang Wei had battled stereotypes abroad, often regarded as just another foreign businessman despite his accomplishments. To hear this maid, a woman society placed at the very margins of recognition, speak of dignity and compassion as though it were a mission carved into her soul, stirred something profound within him. They might have spoken longer, but the clatter of a silver spoon on a glass interrupted them. Across the hall, a speaker announced the start of the morning's investor summit sessions. Executives rose from their tables with calculated poise, each one eager to showcase their influence. Jiang Wei reluctantly stood, giving Amara one last glance before departing. "I hope we speak again," he said quietly. The day that followed was grueling. Inside the opulent conference halls of the Regal Hotel, Jiang Wei was surrounded by some of the most powerful investors on the planet. Presentations flashed across giant LED screens. Charts displayed soaring profits, and ambitious entrepreneurs pitched their startups with slick, rehearsed confidence. But despite the sharp suits and polished speeches, Jiang Wei noticed a common thread running through them all. A language of arrogance, a presumption that money itself granted superiority. They spoke in English, of course, but beneath the surface, it was the language of exclusion. Who belonged, who didn't, who deserved a seat at the table. When his turn came to present, Jiang Wei stood at the podium, calm but inwardly anxious. He had prepared slides, numbers, and projections. Yet as he looked into the sea of expectant faces, he remembered the humiliation of last night and the honesty of Amara's words that morning. Instead of launching into stiff English phrases he had memorized, he paused, closed his laptop, and spoke from his heart and in Mandarin. "I came here not to prove that I belong, but to remind you that business is about people, not just profit," he said. His words were instantly translated by a professional interpreter hired for the summit, but the effect was undeniable. The audience leaned in, surprised by his bold choice. Too often, we measure success by how loud we speak in one language, but the true measure of vision is whether we can listen across cultures, across barriers, across the walls we build in our pride. A hush fell over the room. Some frowned, uncomfortable with the challenge in his words. Others nodded slowly, recognizing the courage it took to stand against convention. When the session ended, Zhang Wei left the stage not to applause, but to something deeper: respect. Yet in his heart he knew the respect that mattered most was not from the investors, but from the maid who had shown him that humanity transcends position. That evening, as he walked through the lobby, he found Amara once more, arranging vases near the elevator. He approached her quietly. "You said you learned Mandarin to give a voice to those ignored," he began. "Would you consider helping me during my time here? Not as a maid, but as my cultural bridge. I cannot trust the polished translators who only speak for money. I need someone who speaks for truth." Amara blinked, stunned. For a moment she thought he might be mocking her, but the sincerity in his eyes dispelled her doubt. Slowly she nodded. "If it means helping you be heard, I will." And with that agreement, fragile yet powerful, a new partnership was born, one that would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. The bridge between worlds. The following days at the Regal Hotel unfolded with a rhythm that seemed at once exhausting and transformative. For Zhang Wei, each morning began with a quiet moment of reflection by the window of his suite, watching the city stretch awake beneath the soft glow of dawn. Yet what truly steadied him was not the skyline or the grandeur of the hotel, but the certainty that at some point during the day, he would see Amara. She had become more than a chance acquaintance. She was a presence that grounded him, reminding him that authenticity mattered more than appearances. After their unexpected agreement to work together, Amara began assisting him discreetly. She was still officially a maid, her uniform marking her as one of the invisible workers of the Regal. But within the orbit of Zhang Wei's world, she became something more, a bridge between cultures, a quiet ally in an environment that thrived on exclusion. When he struggled to convey subtle nuances in English, she stepped in with precise explanations, her Mandarin flowing with ease before she translated his intent into polished English. When executives tried to dismiss his comments with patronizing nods, Amara's firm voice and calm presence reminded them that he was not a man to be overlooked. It did not take long for whispers to spread among the staff and guests alike. Why was a billionaire engaging in daily conversations with a maid? Why did he treat her as though her words carried weight equal to those of polished interpreters or elite advisors? Some scoffed at the sight, dismissing it as eccentricity or indulgence. Others, however, began to sense something different, a kind of authenticity that contrasted sharply with the stiff, calculated performances that usually defined such events. Amara herself struggled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt honored that Zhang Wei valued her knowledge and trusted her perspective. On the other, she worried that her involvement might draw unwanted scrutiny from hotel management. Already she had noticed Robert Eaton, the manager, casting her suspicious glances whenever she stood near Zhang Wei in the lobby or lingered too long by his side during conversations. Robert was a man who prized hierarchy and order. In his eyes, a maid stepping beyond her station was a disruption, perhaps even a threat. Yet Amara held her ground. She had lived too long being invisible, her talents ignored, her worth measured only in how well she polished crystal or folded linen. With Zhang Wei she felt seen, and that feeling alone gave her the courage to endure whatever criticism might follow. One afternoon, after a particularly draining round of negotiations, Zhang Wei invited Amara to sit with him in the hotel's private garden terrace. For the first time since their partnership began, they spoke not of business but of life. The terrace overlooked Central Park, the greenery stretching like a living sea amidst the gray towers of Manhattan. Zhang Wei leaned back in his chair, the exhaustion visible in his eyes, and asked softly, "Amara, tell me, what do you dream of?" The question startled her. Few had ever asked. Most assumed a maid had no dreams beyond survival. She hesitated, then allowed herself to answer honestly. "I dream of studying languages, of becoming a teacher. I want to help children who grow up between worlds. Children who feel out of place, like they belong everywhere and nowhere at once. I want them to know that their voices matter, no matter what language they speak." Zhang Wei listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "You already are a teacher," he replied gently. You taught me more in one evening than years of business could. You taught me that dignity is not given by wealth, but by respect. The sincerity of his words touched her deeply. She had expected compliments, perhaps polite encouragement, but what she heard was recognition, a validation of her worth from a man who could easily have ignored her existence. In that moment, something shifted between them. Their bond was no longer merely one of utility or circumstance. It was rooted in mutual respect, the kind that transcends roles and hierarchies. Yet as their connection deepened, resistance grew stronger. During the second evening of the summit, as Jiang Wei prepared to attend a gala dinner with investors and dignitaries, Robert intercepted him in the lobby. His tone was polite, but the sharpness beneath his words was unmistakable. "Mr. Zhang, while we respect your unique choices, I must remind you that staff members are not permitted to accompany guests to formal events. If you require interpretation services, we have professionals available." Jiang Wei regarded him with calm steadiness. He could have argued, demanded, or even flaunted his wealth to secure compliance. Instead, he responded with quiet authority. "Amara is not here as a maid. She is here as my assistant. If the Regal Hotel cannot respect that, perhaps I should take my business to another establishment." The threat was subtle but effective. Robert's jaw tightened, his mask of politeness slipping for an instant before he regained composure. "Of course, Mr. Zhang. We will make the necessary accommodations." That night, Amara stood by Jiang Wei's side at the gala, dressed not in her uniform, but in a simple navy dress he had arranged for her. Though she felt out of place amidst the glittering gowns and tuxedos, Jiang Wei's calm presence steadied her. As conversation swirled around them, he introduced her not as staff but as his cultural advisor, and the shock on the faces of seasoned investors was almost comical. Some dismissed her with barely concealed disdain, but others, recognizing the boldness of Jiang Wei's choice, regarded her with newfound curiosity. For Amara, it was a night of contradictions. On one hand, she felt the sting of skeptical gazes, the whispers that questioned her right to stand among the elite. On the other, she felt the quiet pride of knowing that she was no longer invisible. She was being seen not just as a maid, but as a woman of knowledge, dignity, and value. Later, as the gala ended and the city lights shimmered against the night sky, Jiang Wei and Amara walked back through the quiet halls of the Regal. He paused before the elevator, turning to her with a look of quiet conviction. "Amara, the world will always try to place us in boxes, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, master or servant. But tonight you showed them that respect cannot be confined. You stood tall, and I am proud to stand beside you." Her heart swelled at his words. For the first time in years, she felt as though her dreams were not distant fantasies but possibilities waiting to be claimed. As the elevator doors closed behind them, both sensed that their journey had only just begun, and that together, they would challenge not only the walls of the Regal Hotel, but the deeper walls society built between human beings. Shadows of resistance. The days that followed the gala dinner brought both opportunity and challenge. Jiang Wei's decision to recognize Amara publicly as his cultural advisor, rather than treating her as mere staff, had created ripples across the summit. Some guests, intrigued by his unconventional choice, began approaching him with genuine curiosity, eager to understand his perspective. Others, however, viewed it as a breach of unwritten rules, a disruption of the carefully maintained hierarchies that defined high society. For them, the sight of a billionaire elevating a hotel maid to the level of professional respect was not an act of inclusivity but a threat to the order they so desperately clung to. Whispers spread through the halls of the Regal like smoke curling through narrow corridors. Investors exchanged sly remarks over cocktails. "Why risk his reputation for the sake of a maid?" one murmured. "It is unbecoming, even scandalous." Another shook his head with a smug grin. "Perhaps he doesn't understand how things work in New York. Money speaks here, not sentiment." These voices reached Amara's ears, and though she tried to ignore them, their sharp edges left small wounds in her spirit. She was no stranger to being overlooked, but now the scrutiny came with an intensity that felt different, almost suffocating. Robert Eaton, the hotel manager, seized upon this discontent with quiet calculation. Though outwardly polite to Jiang Wei, he resented the disruption to his pristine order. To him, Amara's presence at the gala had been nothing short of insubordination, and worse, it had been sanctioned by the very guest whose approval he could not afford to lose. For days afterward, he monitored her closely, searching for mistakes, waiting for opportunities to remind her of her place. When she lingered too long in conversation with Zhang Wei in the lobby, Robert would summon her with trivial tasks, his voice laced with false civility. "Miss Johnson, the third-floor carpets require attention, immediately." His eyes would flick toward Zhang Wei as if to say, "You may tolerate this, but I will not." Amara endured it with dignity, but privately she wrestled with doubts. Was she jeopardizing her livelihood by standing beside Zhang Wei? Did her presence truly help him, or was she only making him a target for ridicule? Late at night in the small apartment she shared with her younger brother, she sat by the window and stared at the flickering city lights. Her brother, Malik, only 18, often asked her why she worked so tirelessly, why she carried burdens heavier than her years. To him she was both sister and mother, protector and provider. She could not afford to falter, and yet, for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps her dreams of teaching languages, of living beyond the constraints of invisibility, might not be as distant as she once believed. Meanwhile, Zhang Wei faced his own trials. During closed-door negotiations, certain investors deliberately tested him, interrupting his presentations, dismissing his ideas with subtle mockery, or feigning confusion at his accented English. He recognized the tactic, a dance of power meant to undermine his credibility. But with Amara by his side, translating his intent with precision and reinforcing his message with clarity, he found new strength. She had a way of distilling his thoughts, of ensuring his vision was not lost in translation, and this not only amplified his presence, but also unsettled those who sought to diminish him. They could not ignore him when every word, every pause, every conviction was carried forward with unmistakable confidence. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Zhang Wei invited Amara once again to the terrace overlooking Central Park. The autumn air carried a crisp chill, and the city below was alive with the flicker of countless lights. He poured tea for them both, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though he were back in Shanghai hosting an honored guest. "Amara," he said after a long pause, "do you realize what you are doing? You are not only helping me, you are showing these people that dignity cannot be assigned by title or wealth. You are challenging their perception simply by standing beside me." Amara looked down at the steaming cup in her hands. "Sometimes I wonder if I am strong enough," she admitted softly. "Every look, every whisper feels heavier than the last. I've fought invisibility my whole life. But now it feels as though the world sees me only to question why I exist in their space." Zhang Wei leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I know that feeling. In many rooms, even as a billionaire, I'm seen not as a man but as a foreigner. They measure me not by my vision but by my accent, my appearance, my difference. But strength is not in being accepted by their standards. It is in standing firm in your own truth. You are strong because you refuse to disappear, even when they want you to." His words filled her with a warmth that lingered long after the conversation ended. For perhaps the first time, she realized that her struggles, her resilience, and even her pain were not signs of weakness but sources of strength. Yet the forces against them were not idle. The next day, Robert called Amara into his office. The room was immaculate, every surface polished, every detail reflecting his obsession with order. He sat behind his mahogany desk, his expression cool and detached. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice smooth but edged with authority, "I have received complaints from several guests regarding your unusual involvement with Mr. Zhang. While I understand his personal preferences, you must remember that your role here is defined. You are staff, nothing more. To blur those lines is to compromise the standards of this hotel." Amara stood tall, though her heart pounded. "With respect, sir, I was helping a guest in need. That is my duty, is it not? To ensure guests feel respected and comfortable." Robert's lips curved into a cold smile. "Do not mistake tolerance for approval. You may think yourself indispensable now, but staff are easily replaced. I suggest you remember that before overstepping again." The veiled threat was clear, but so too was Amara's resolve. She left his office shaken but not broken. If anything, Robert's words only deepened her commitment. She knew that her partnership with Zhang Wei was no longer just about translation or assistance. It was about standing against the invisible walls that confined people like her to lives of silence. That evening, when she saw Jiang Wei again, she did not hide her encounter with Robert. She told him everything, the warning, the threat, the disdain. Jiang Wei listened in silence, his expression calm but his eyes burning with quiet fire. When she finished, he spoke with deliberate clarity. "Amara, you do not stand alone. If they threaten you, they threaten me. And I promise you, I will not allow them to strip you of your dignity." For Amara, those words carried more weight than any promise she had ever heard. In that moment, she realized that their partnership was no longer just about business or language. It was about solidarity. Together, they were more than the sum of their roles. They were, in a world obsessed with hierarchy, a living example of what it meant to bridge divides. As the summit approached its final day, the tension in the air was palpable. Decisions would be made, partnerships signed, reputations cemented. Jiang Wei and Amara knew that the choices before them would not only shape the future of his empire, but also determine whether their quiet defiance of social expectations would be remembered as a bold act of courage or dismissed as a fleeting anomaly. Yet, as they prepared for what lay ahead, neither wavered. The bond forged in the crucible of humiliation and resistance had grown into something resilient, something neither whispers nor threats could easily break. And though the shadows of resistance still loomed, they carried within them a light that refused to be extinguished. Shadows of resistance. The days that followed the gala dinner brought both opportunity and challenge. Jiang Wei's decision to recognize Amara publicly as his cultural advisor, rather than treating her as mere staff, had created ripples across the summit. Some guests, intrigued by his unconventional choice, began approaching him with genuine curiosity, eager to understand his perspective. Others, however, viewed it as a breach of unwritten rules, a disruption of the carefully maintained hierarchies that defined high society. For them, the sight of a billionaire elevating a hotel maid to the level of professional respect was not an act of inclusivity but a threat to the order they so desperately clung to. Whispers spread through the halls of the Regal like smoke curling through narrow corridors. Investors exchanged sly remarks over cocktails. "Why risk his reputation for the sake of a maid?" one murmured. "It is unbecoming, even scandalous." Another shook his head with a smug grin. "Perhaps he doesn't understand how things work in New York. Money speaks here, not sentiment." These voices reached Amara's ears, and though she tried to ignore them, their sharp edges left small wounds in her spirit. She was no stranger to being overlooked, but now the scrutiny came with an intensity that felt different, almost suffocating. Robert Eaton, the hotel manager, seized upon this discontent with quiet calculation. Though outwardly polite to Jiang Wei, he resented the disruption to his pristine order. To him, Amara's presence at the gala had been nothing short of insubordination, and worse, it had been sanctioned by the very guest whose approval he could not afford to lose. For days afterward, he monitored her closely, searching for mistakes, waiting for opportunities to remind her of her place. When she lingered too long in conversation with Jiang Wei in the lobby, Robert would summon her with trivial tasks, his voice laced with false civility. "Miss Johnson, the third-floor carpets require attention, immediately." His eyes would flick toward Jiang Wei as if to say, "You may tolerate this, but I will not." Amara endured it with dignity, but privately she wrestled with doubts. Was she jeopardizing her livelihood by standing beside Jiang Wei? Did her presence truly help him, or was she only making him a target for ridicule? Late at night in the small apartment she shared with her younger brother, she sat by the window and stared at the flickering city lights. Her brother, Malik, only 18, often asked her why she worked so tirelessly, why she carried burdens heavier than her years. To him, she was both sister and mother, protector and provider. She could not afford to falter, and yet, for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps her dreams of teaching languages, of living beyond the constraints of invisibility, might not be as distant as she once believed. Meanwhile, Jiang Wei faced his own trials. During closed-door negotiations, certain investors deliberately tested him, interrupting his presentations, dismissing his ideas with subtle mockery, or feigning confusion at his accented English. He recognized the tactic, a dance of power meant to undermine his credibility. But with Amara by his side, translating his intent with precision and reinforcing his message with clarity, He found new strength. She had a way of distilling his thoughts, of ensuring his vision was not lost in translation, and this not only amplified his presence, but also unsettled those who sought to diminish him. They could not ignore him when every word, every pause, every conviction was carried forward with unmistakable confidence. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Jiang Wei invited Amara once again to the terrace overlooking Central Park. The autumn air carried a crisp chill, and the city below was alive with the flicker of countless lights. He poured tea for them both, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though he were back in Shanghai hosting an honored guest. "Amara," he said after a long pause, "do you realize what you are doing? You are not only helping me, you are showing these people that dignity cannot be assigned by title or wealth. You are challenging their perception simply by standing beside me." Amara looked down at the steaming cup in her hands. "Sometimes I wonder if I am strong enough," she admitted softly. "Every look, every whisper feels heavier than the last. I've fought invisibility my whole life. But now it feels as though the world sees me only to question why I exist in their space." Jiang Wei leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I know that feeling. In many rooms, even as a billionaire, I'm seen not as a man but as a foreigner. They measure me not by my vision but by my accent, my appearance, my difference. But strength is not in being accepted by their standards. It is in standing firm in your own truth. You are strong because you refuse to disappear, even when they want you to." His words filled her with a warmth that lingered long after the conversation ended. For perhaps the first time, she realized that her struggles, her resilience, and even her pain were not signs of weakness but sources of strength. Yet the forces against them were not idle. The next day, Robert called Amara into his office. The room was immaculate, every surface polished, every detail reflecting his obsession with order. He sat behind his mahogany desk, his expression cool and detached. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice smooth but edged with authority, "I have received complaints from several guests regarding your unusual involvement with Mr. Zhang. While I understand his personal preferences, you must remember that your role here is defined. You are staff, nothing more. To blur those lines is to compromise the standards of this hotel." Amara stood tall, though her heart pounded. "With respect, sir, I was helping a guest in need. That is my duty, is it not? To ensure guests feel respected and comfortable." Robert's lips curved into a cold smile. "Do not mistake tolerance for approval. You may think yourself indispensable now, but staff are easily replaced. I suggest you remember that before overstepping again." The veiled threat was clear, but so too was Amara's resolve. She left his office shaken but not broken. If anything, Robert's words only deepened her commitment. She knew that her partnership with Jiang Wei was no longer just about translation or assistance. It was about standing against the invisible walls that confined people like her to lives of silence. That evening, when she saw Jiang Wei again, she did not hide her encounter with Robert. She told him everything, the warning, the threat, the disdain. Jiang Wei listened in silence, his expression calm but his eyes burning with quiet fire. When she finished, he spoke with deliberate clarity. "Amara, you do not stand alone. If they threaten you, they threaten me. And I promise you, I will not allow them to strip you of your dignity." For Amara, those words carried more weight than any promise she had ever heard. In that moment, she realized that their partnership was no longer just about business or language. It was about solidarity. Together, they were more than the sum of their roles. They were, in a world obsessed with hierarchy, a living example of what it meant to bridge divides. As the summit approached its final day, the tension in the air was palpable. Decisions would be made, partnerships signed, reputations cemented. Jiang Wei and Amara knew that the choices before them would not only shape the future of his empire, but also determine whether their quiet defiance of social expectations would be remembered as a bold act of courage or dismissed as a fleeting anomaly. Yet, as they prepared for what lay ahead, neither wavered. The bond forged in the crucible of humiliation and resistance had grown into something resilient, something neither whispers nor threats could easily break. And though the shadows of resistance still loomed, they carried within them a light that refused to be extinguished. The turning point. The final day of the summit arrived with a kind of electric tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The Regal Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a stage where reputations would be either forged into gold or crushed into dust. Rows of glittering chandeliers illuminated the polished mahogany floor, casting their light across round tables covered with linen as white as winter snow. Screens displayed the logos of companies vying for partnerships, while the air itself seemed thick with anticipation. Investors and executives from across the world gathered, their conversations weaving a tapestry of ambition, calculation, and thinly veiled rivalry. Jiang Wei entered the ballroom with the calm composure of a man who had spent his life walking into rooms designed to test him. Yet beneath his serene exterior lay the memory of every insult, every whisper, every skeptical glance he had endured over the past days. He was no stranger to opposition. In fact, his empire had been built on overcoming it. But this moment was different. This was not merely about financial success. It was about standing as a symbol of dignity in a world that so often dismissed those who refused to conform. At his side walked Amara, no longer in her maid's uniform but in a modest yet elegant dress he had insisted on providing. Her posture was straight, her eyes steady, though inside she felt the weight of every stare directed their way. From the corner of the room, Robert Eaton observed with narrowed eyes. Though he wore the same polished smile as always, his thoughts betrayed him. To him, Amara's presence here, dressed not as staff but as a respected aide, was an affront to everything he believed about order and hierarchy. He had tried to stop her and failed. Now he could only watch as she stood beside the very man whose favor he could not afford to lose. Yet Robert consoled himself with the belief that sooner or later, society itself would put her back in her place. The morning sessions began with presentations from various entrepreneurs. They spoke in polished English, their slides filled with graphs and projections, their tones confident but rehearsed. Applause followed each one, but it was polite, restrained, the kind given out of habit rather than inspiration. When Jiang Wei's name was announced, the room fell into a different kind of silence. Some leaned forward with curiosity, others folded their arms with skepticism. He had already disrupted the expected narrative by refusing to hide his reliance on Amara, and many were waiting to see whether he would falter. He stepped to the podium, Amara just behind him, ready to support. Instead of beginning with slides or charts, he placed his notes aside and spoke in Mandarin. The interpreter assigned by the summit immediately prepared to translate, but Jiang Wei raised a hand gently. "Today," he said in deliberate, accented English, his voice calm but strong, "I will not speak through numbers alone. Numbers tell you profit, but they do not tell you people. And business without people is nothing." A ripple of surprise ran through the room. His English was not perfect, but it was deliberate, careful, and powerful. Then, after a brief pause, he switched back to Mandarin, his voice carrying more fluidly. Amara stepped forward, translating with a clarity that conveyed not just the words but the spirit behind them. Together, they became a harmony, his vision and her voice interwoven, impossible to separate. He spoke of resilience, of building companies not as empires of wealth, but as bridges between cultures. He told the story of his humble beginnings, of being dismissed because of his accent, his foreignness, his refusal to conform to Western expectations. And then, with a glance at Amara, he broadened the story beyond himself. "Respect," he said, "is not determined by the clothes you wear, the accent in your voice, or the wealth in your account. Respect is what you give freely, and it is what defines true greatness." As Amara translated, her voice steady and rich, she realized that she was not just echoing his thoughts. She was part of them. His story was hers too. The story of someone overlooked, dismissed, yet unwilling to bow to invisibility. Her voice carried across the ballroom, reaching even those who had scoffed at her days before. For the first time, she was not simply a maid translating for a billionaire. She was a woman standing at the intersection of two worlds, proving that language was not just about words but about humanity itself. The room erupted in applause, louder and more genuine than any before. Yet not everyone was moved. From one of the front tables, a rival businessman, a sleek, sharp-tongued executive from a competing tech empire, rose to speak. His smile was cold, his voice laced with subtle venom. "An inspiring speech, Mr. Zhang, but let us be honest. Business is about results. Sentiment does not build empires. You speak of respect, yet you rely on a maid to give you a voice. Tell me, is this the image of strength you want to show the world?" A hush fell over the room. The words struck like a blade, sharp and calculated. All eyes turned toward Jiang Wei, waiting to see how he would respond. Amara's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, fear flickered through her. Yet Jiang Wei's composure did not waver. He looked directly at his rival, then at the audience. "Yes," he said simply, his voice calm but unyielding, "because strength is not in pretending to stand alone. True strength is in recognizing those who walk beside you. Amara is not my weakness. She is my ally. And if the world cannot see the value of such alliances, then perhaps it is the world that is weak, not us." The words rang out with a force that silence could not contain. Applause broke again, this time thunderous, echoing across the chandeliers and shaking even the skeptics. For the first time, Amara felt the room's gaze shift, not the gaze of ridicule or doubt, but of recognition. They saw her now not as a maid, not as an outlier, but as a woman whose courage had elevated a man others already feared and respected. Later that evening, as the summit drew to a close, investors approached Jiang Wei with offers, partnerships, and congratulations. Many of them, however, also turned to Amara, some with awkward courtesy, others with genuine admiration. For her, it was overwhelming. She had spent years blending into the background, unnoticed except when a task needed doing. Now she stood in the center of attention. Her voice remembered, her presence acknowledged. When the ballroom finally emptied and the noise of the day faded into silence, Jiang Wei and Amara returned once more to the terrace. The city glowed beneath them, alive and restless as always. Amara leaned against the railing, her heart still racing. "I don't know how to process all of this," she admitted. "1 week ago, I was invisible. Tonight, people saw me. They actually saw me." Jiang Wei poured tea, his movements calm and deliberate. "The world has a way of pretending it does not see those it deems unworthy. But once they are forced to look, they cannot look away. You reminded them today that worth is not decided by role or by status. You reminded them that respect is the foundation of everything." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "Do you really believe that?" He nodded slowly. "I do. And I believe this is only the beginning. Together we can build something greater than empires. We can build bridges." The night stretched around them, the city humming with endless possibility. For the first time in years, both Jiang Wei and Amara felt that their journeys, though different, had converged for a reason larger than either of them could have imagined. The summit had not only changed how others saw them, it had changed how they saw themselves. The dawn of respect winter had settled over Manhattan with an icy firmness, the kind that turned breath into smoke and painted frost along the glass towers of the city. Snow dusted the avenues, muffling the usual chaos of honking cars and rushing footsteps, as though the world itself had paused to reflect. Inside the Regal Hotel, however, the atmosphere remained as intense as ever. The summit was long over, yet its echoes still reverberated through the corridors. Guests whispered of the Chinese billionaire who had defied convention, of the maid who had spoken fluent Mandarin and stood with him as an equal. Some remembered it with admiration, others with contempt, but no one could deny that something had shifted. For Jiang Wei, the weeks that followed were a whirlwind of negotiations and offers. Investors who once dismissed him now competed for his attention, while rivals who mocked him found themselves grudgingly acknowledging his resilience. Yet amidst the noise of deals and contracts, he remained steady in his conviction. The victory was not in the signatures on paper, but in the principle he had defended. And that principle was embodied in Amara. Amara herself was transformed. Where once she moved through the hotel like a shadow, unnoticed except for her labor, now she walked with a quiet dignity that could not be ignored. The staff regarded her differently, some with envy, others with newfound respect. Even Robert Eaton, though still unable to conceal his resentment, tempered his hostility. He could not afford open conflict with a guest of Jiang Wei's stature, nor could he deny the undeniable truth. Amara had become more than her uniform, but recognition came with a price. The media storm that followed the summit refused to fade. Every article, every editorial, every comment dissected her presence. Some celebrated her courage, calling her a symbol of breaking barriers, while others insisted she was unqualified, an opportunist riding on the coattails of a billionaire. At first, the scrutiny weighed heavily on her shoulders. She was not accustomed to being the subject of public debate. Yet each time doubt threatened to consume her, she remembered Jiang Wei's words in the park. Cages are not always made of walls. Sometimes they are made of whispers. and she resolved that whispers would not define her. One particularly cold evening, Jiang Wei invited Amara to a private dinner in his suite. The city stretched below them, glittering like a field of diamonds scattered across black velvet. He had arranged the table himself, a gesture unusual for a man of his wealth but meaningful in its simplicity. There was tea, of course, and dishes that reminded him of home: steamed fish, dumplings, and stir-fried vegetables, prepared by a chef who understood the subtlety of flavors that spoke not only to the stomach, but to the soul. As they ate, Jiang Wei spoke of his plans. "Amara," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I am expanding my company's operations in the United States. I want to build not just businesses, but communities, places where language and culture are not barriers, but bridges. I want you to be part of that. Not as a maid, not even just as my advisor, but as a leader." Her fork paused midair. "A leader?" she repeated, the word heavy with disbelief. He nodded firmly. "You have vision, strength, and empathy, qualities many so-called leaders lack. You understand what it means to be unseen, and that is why you can help others be seen. I want you to oversee our cultural outreach programs, to work with schools, with immigrant communities, with anyone who has been told their voice does not matter. You will not just translate language. You will translate dignity." Tears welled in Amara's eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. "Jiang Wei, I never imagined a life beyond cleaning rooms and folding sheets. I dreamed, yes, but dreams always felt so far away. And now you tell me this as if it were possible." He smiled gently. "Dreams only remain impossible until someone believes in them. I believe in you." That night, something inside Amara shifted forever. The doubts that had clung to her for years began to loosen their grip, replaced by a fragile but growing confidence. She realized that Jiang Wei was not simply offering her an opportunity. He was offering her the chance to reclaim her story, to step into a life defined not by circumstance but by choice. News of her new role spread quickly, igniting another wave of discussion. Some mocked it as foolish, others praised it as revolutionary. But Amara no longer allowed those voices to dictate her worth. She embraced the work with passion, pouring herself into building programs that connected people across languages and cultures. She visited schools, speaking to children who reminded her of her younger self, children caught between identities, uncertain of their place. She told them that their voices mattered, that they were bridges, not burdens. Slowly, the narrative began to change. The same media that once ridiculed her now featured stories of her impact. Photos of her standing with children, teaching them words in both English and Mandarin, began circulating with captions like, "From Maid to Mentor." She was no longer just Jiang Wei's advisor. She was becoming a figure of inspiration in her own right. Meanwhile, Jiang Wei's ventures flourished, not because of the deals he secured, but because of the authenticity he carried. Investors who partnered with him soon discovered that his vision was not mere sentiment. It was strategy. By building bridges where others built walls, he tapped into markets and communities that had long been overlooked. And through it all, Amara remained by his side, not as a symbol of charity, but as a partner whose voice carried weight equal to his own. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Jiang Wei and Amara returned to the Regal Hotel, the very place where their story had begun with humiliation and whispers. This time, the atmosphere was different. The staff greeted them with deference, guests glanced with recognition, and even Robert Eaton forced a smile that could not quite conceal his unease. They walked through the grand lobby side by side, no longer as guest and maid, but as allies who had weathered storms and emerged stronger. Standing beneath the chandeliers, Jiang Wei turned to Amara with quiet reflection. "Do you remember the first night we met? I was lost in translation, and they looked at me as if I were nothing. But you spoke, and suddenly I was not alone. You gave me dignity when I had none. I will never forget that." Amara smiled, her eyes bright with the memory. "And I will never forget that you saw me when no one else did. You believed in me, and because of that, I found the courage to believe in myself." In that moment, as the bustling lobby faded into the background, both understood the truth. Their story was not just about overcoming prejudice or breaking barriers. It was about the power of human connection, the kind that transcends wealth, status, and language. It was about choosing to see each other fully, and in doing so, discovering strength neither could have found alone. The world would continue to whisper, as it always did. But Jiang Wei and Amara had learned that whispers could not break them. For they had built something stronger than walls, stronger than prejudice. They had built a bridge. And across that bridge they would continue to walk, not just as individuals bound by circumstance, but as partners bound by respect, resilience, and the unshakable belief that every voice deserved to be heard.